Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Crime and Punishment story. This week I am covering the strange and tragic case of George Soulsby and the murder of Thomas Fenwick, which took place in Sunderland in 1884. I hope you will find it interesting. Sadly, there is very little information about the past lives of those involved in this week's story, so the backstory of their lives will be quite basic. George Soulsby was born in Northumberland in around 1856 to parents Moses and Mary, and was one of at least 6 children. He was described as being around 5'5" tall, with dark brown hair and hazel eyes. In 1884, he was working as a slater in Sunderland. He was not someone who had any previous convictions, and was said to be well liked by those who knew him. Thomas Fenwick, the victim, was around 54 years old at the time of his death, so would have been born in around 1830. His place of birth is unknown. In 1884 he lived in Sunderland and was said to be a shipwright. However, he had been ill for some time and had not been working. He was described as being someone who did drink quite a lot. In fact, his drinking had been part of the reason for his recent health problems, and his doctor had advised him not to drink anymore or it would kill him. Before we go any further, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you're new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. It really is appreciated. And it is completely free to subscribe. It doesn't cost you any money, but it really does help to support the channel. And as always, I just want to add that I do record these stories live, so I do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify. So I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. The following is the official reported information from the papers of the time of how the crime took place. Now, this would change with some new information coming to light after the trial. On June the 27th, 1884, Thomas Fenwick was in his home in Sunderland. He had just had a meal and was lying down on the sofa asleep. George Soulsby called at the house to see him. He spoke to the young girl cleaning windows outside to ask if Thomas was in, and she told him he was, and she let George into the house and followed him inside. Thomas was still asleep, and George shook him to wake him and ask him how he was. Thomas said he was well. George then went outside to the workshop and returned with a hammer. He then struck Thomas a sharp blow on the head with the hammer. He then casually took the hammer back to the workshop and left the house as if nothing had happened. The police and a doctor were sent for, and the young girl Jane told the police that the man who had attacked Thomas was George Soulsby, and he was arrested for willfully wounding Thomas Soulsby, to which he replied, "He struck me first." Thomas died on July the 3rd, and after this George was charged with his willful murder, to which he made the simple reply, "I did not do it." The inquest was held at the Oak Tree Inn at Sunderland before Coroner Maynard. Richard Fenwick said he had identified the body as being that of his brother Thomas, who was 54 years old. Jane Stevenson said she was 14 years old and lived in Sunderland. She said she had been in Thomas's house on June the 27th. She had made him a meal and he had lain down and gone to sleep. She said she'd gone outside to clean the windows, and while she was doing this, George Soulsby came up to speak to her. She said he asked if Thomas, who she called Uncle, was in, and she said he was. She then let George into the house, and she said she followed him in. She said Thomas was still asleep on the sofa, and George went over to him and shook him by the shoulder until he woke up. George asked him how he was, and Thomas replied that he was quite well. Jane said he then went back to sleep. She said the men did not argue, and she did not see anything unusual about the conversation. But she said George then left the room and went out to the workshop at the back of the house, returning a few moments later with a hammer in his hand. He walked up to Thomas, who was still asleep, and struck him a heavy blow on the forehead. He then walked back out to the workshop and left the house by the back door. She said she didn't know what to do. She went into the kitchen at first and she said she was crying, and her mother came in a few minutes later. Amelia Stevenson said she lived next door to Thomas in Sunderland. She said she had seen someone come out of the house and go into the workshop. She had not seen who it was. She called to her neighbour and asked who it had been, and she was told it was George Soulsby. She said she then ran into the house to see what he had wanted with Thomas, and when she arrived she found Jane crying and Thomas in a sitting position on the sofa with blood pouring from a wound in his head. She'd gone into the workshop and there she found a hammer covered in blood. She said they then sent for the police and the policeman told them to send for a doctor. P.C. Dykstra said, acting on information received, he had gone to the home of Thomas Fenwick on the afternoon of June 27th. He found Thomas sitting on the sofa. He said his face was bruised and bleeding and there was a pool of blood on the floor beside the sofa. He was told that George Soulsby had attacked him with a hammer. He said Mrs. Stevenson had given him the hammer she had found in the workshop, which was covered with blood. He said he then took Mrs. Stevenson and her daughter Jane to the lodging house where George lived so that they could identify him. He said as they went in, George was sitting at the table eating a meal. Jane, he said, pointed at George and said, "That is the man who struck my uncle." He said George replied saying, "He struck me first." P.C. Dykstra said he spoke to George and told him, "You have done a bad job, George. You will have to come with me to the police station." He said George replied, "Stop till I finish my tea." I have to admit this part of the story baffled me, as the police officer then waited while George finished his meal. Oh, excuse me, I'm very sorry about that. The air went the wrong way. P.C. Dykstra said he instructed Mrs. Stevenson and Jane to send for a doctor and sent the two women back to Thomas's house, and after George had finished his meal, he put on his coat and came with him to the police station without any issue. He said he charged him with willfully wounding Thomas, and George replied, "Yes, yes," then stated the address where the incident had taken place. He said after Thomas had died, he charged George with the willful murder, and George said he had not done it. Dr. Wood said he had been called to see Thomas on the evening of the 27th. He had a wound near his nose, and his nose was broken and his eyes were beginning to turn black. He said he also seemed to be semi-conscious. There was not much he could do for him at the time. He said he returned to see him 2 days later. He had been sent for as Thomas was suffering fits. He believed that these were caused from the injury he had received. He said this had continued until his death on July the 3rd. He said he had also performed the post-mortem on the body of Thomas Fenwick along with Dr. Pedrosa and Dr. Rankin. He said they found blood clots on the brain, which would have been as a result of the injury from the hammer blow. He said apart from the kidneys, all of the other organs of the body were healthy. He said it was his professional opinion that death had been caused by the blood clots on the brain. Dr. Pedrosa gave evidence only to agree with the details given by Dr. Wood. Dr. Rankin did not give any evidence at the inquest. No further evidence was given, and the coroner spoke to the jury to state that this seemed to be a very clear case. There seemed to be no reason for the attack on Thomas Fenwick, and they simply had to decide if this attack was done out of malice. The prisoner had said that Thomas had struck him first, but no evidence had been given to support this, and he did not feel this was a case that could be anything other than murder. The jury retired for a very short time before returning a verdict of guilty of willful murder against George Soulsby, and he was committed for trial. I did not find any details of a funeral for Thomas Fenwick. It is clear that he had family in the area. However, there is no evidence to suggest that they had the means to pay for a funeral. This again may have been the case of a pauper's funeral. Sadly, this seems to be the most likely option for a lot of the cases that we have covered recently. I did not find any evidence of a headstone for Thomas anywhere in the area. The trial took place in Durham in July of 1884 before Mr. Justice Matthew. George Soulsby pleaded not guilty to the charge of willful murder. As is often the case, the evidence at the trial is the same as that given at the inquest, and in this case the majority of the evidence focuses on the 3 doctors who were present at the post-mortem of Thomas Fenwick, one of whom had also been treating Thomas for several months prior to this. However, there was also some other new evidence given. Jane Stevenson stated that Thomas had been ill for some time and that Dr. Rankin had been treating him. He had ordered ice to be applied to an area behind his ear. She said she did not remember Thomas's face swelling at any time prior to the hammer attack, nor did she remember Thomas becoming paralysed down his left-hand side. She said she often went to his house, so she would have noticed this. However, she did say he had suffered from fits prior to the hammer attack. She said he was known to be quarrelsome when he had been drinking. She said Dr. Rankin had seen Thomas after the hammer attack, but the police surgeon had taken over his care. Mary Ballantyne said she lived close to Thomas in Sunderland. She said a little after Easter in 1884 she had been in his house along with George Soulsby and his cousin Mrs. Dawson. She said Mrs. Dawson used to be the housekeeper for Thomas. She said George and Thomas had argued that day. Thomas had threatened George with the poker, saying that George had blackened his eye. She said George told him that he had struck him first on that occasion as well. Dorothy Dawson said she used to be the housekeeper for Thomas at Sunderland. She did not talk of the earlier argument between George and Thomas. However, she did say that they had had previous arguments. She did not say why she thought the 2 men did not get on. She also said that Thomas began having fits after he'd been attacked when he had been drunk in Sunderland sometime in March. She said his head had been all swollen and he had told her he had what we would call now cellulitis. She said Thomas often drank whiskey, often taken a drink of whiskey and sometimes wine to bed with him, and she said she had also seen him drunk first thing in the morning. She said Dr. Rankin had told him to stop drinking. Dr. Wood was asked again to confirm his thoughts on the cause of death. He again stated that the hammer attack had been the main reason for the blood cuts and the cause of death. Dr. Pedrosa was also recalled, and he stated that he also agreed with the evidence given by Dr. Wood. Dr. Rankin was then called by the defence. He said that he had been taking care of Thomas since February that year. He said he had previously taken fits and had been paralysed down the left-hand side of his body. He said he did not believe the hammer attack had caused his death. He said he had seen him just prior to Dr. Wood taking over his care, and Thomas had told him he'd been out to the pub for a drink. He said he told him that he must not leave his bed, he was too ill to go out. He said during the post-mortem the clots he saw on the brain did not appear to be new. He felt they had most likely been caused by his earlier injury when he had been attacked in March of 1884. He said he could not attribute the death of Thomas to the hammer attack by George Soulsby in any way. Dr. Wood and Dr. Pedrosa were both recalled, and both said they did not agree with the evidence of Dr. Rankin. Both again said death had been caused by the hammer attack on June the 27th. George did not give evidence on his own behalf. Sadly, I did not find any details of the summing up from the prosecution, the defence or the judge. It is rare, but it does sometimes happen that their speeches are not reported in the local papers. However, I think we can be sure that the judge, at the very least, would have mentioned the different opinions of the doctors. The jury retired for an hour and 5 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty of wilful murder against George Soulsby, but with a strong recommendation to mercy. The judge then sentenced George to death by hanging, and that his remains would be buried within the walls of Durham Prison. He also stated the recommendation of the jury would be passed to the Home Secretary in due course. George then asked if he could say something, and the judge simply replied, "No," and he was removed from the dock and taken back to prison. A short time after the trial, George released a statement from prison. He said he was entirely innocent of the crime. He stated he had acted in self-defence. He said he did indeed shake Thomas awake and ask him how he was, but Thomas did not go back to sleep. In fact, he said he jumped up and struck him a blow in the face. He said he had struck back, and when he saw that Thomas was about to hit him again, he had struck him several times on the nose and knocked him down. He added that he had never gone into the workshop and had not struck Thomas with a hammer, and he also stated that Jane Stevenson could not have known what had happened, as far as he was aware, she was never in the room at the same time as he had been when he was fighting with Thomas. This statement does not seem to be mentioned at either the inquest or the trial, and it is this that I referred to at the beginning of the story when I said the attack with the hammer was the official story printed when the attack first took place. Regardless of the jury recommending mercy, a petition for a reprieve for George Soulsby was quickly started, as many people felt that he was not the person fully responsible for the death of Thomas Fenwick. It was believed by many that Thomas would have died anyway due to the injuries he had received at an earlier time when he was attacked in March, and because Dr. Rankin had been treating him for some time and did not agree with Dr. Wood and Dr. Pedrosa, most seemed to believe the evidence of Dr. Rankin. The petition was signed by many people of the area. And whether it was the petition or not, the Home Secretary did commute the sentence of death to one of penal servitude for life, and George was eventually sent to Portland Prison. However, a later report in the papers dated in July of 1894 stated that George had been released from prison and had returned to Sunderland. It was said huge crowds had gathered at the station for his return, and when he appeared, cheers were heard and hats and handkerchiefs were waved in the air. George himself stated that he intended to remain in Sunderland and hoped to soon be able to return to work. The last evidence I found of George Soulsby was in 1911, when he was listed as a slater and appeared to be living with some family members, and he was also listed as being married. However, I did not find any details of his marriage or his wife, but it is possible that she was a lady by the name of Sarah. I did not find any evidence of any children for George Soulsby. Once again, this was a very strange story. There seems to be no evidence given at any time to explain why the two men, Thomas and George, do not seem to get on and seem to fight and argue every time they meet. I did find one article where it suggested that George had attacked Thomas out of jealousy. However, there was no evidence or information to explain what it was that he could have possibly been jealous of. And we do have evidence from two people of an argument just a few months before Thomas's death, but again, no other details of anything after that or what that argument was caused by. The evidence of Jane Stevenson does seem very strange. Why, without any warning, would George attack Thomas while he was asleep after asking him how he was? It simply doesn't make any sense to me. And although we don't hear about it until after the trial, I did find the idea that Thomas had attacked George that day and that George had struck back to be a much more realistic version of what went on that day in June, other than Thomas just suddenly attacking him with a hammer. Of course, this does not explain the blood on the hammer found in the workshop, unless someone else had attacked Thomas with it, after George had left. The doctors not agreeing on the cause of death is something we have heard before. In fact, it did come up in another recent story. But it seems that as two doctors did agree, the jury had gone with their evidence rather than Dr. Rankin, who did not think the recent attack was the cause of death. So were the jury correct to find George guilty of murder? Well, to be honest, it seems they never got to hear George's version, and they had two doctors telling them he was the reason Thomas died. Then they did not really have any other option. I have to admit I can't really decide if George was guilty or not. I find the hammer story a little bizarre. However, I do not think he was entirely innocent, and he did play a part, however small, in the death of Thomas Fenwick, as his attack, even if it was just with his fists, cannot have helped coming so soon after the previous attack. But what do you think? Do you think George really did go inside the house and attack a sleeping man with a hammer for no apparent reason? Or do you think Thomas struck George first and he simply defended himself and no hammer was ever used? Do you think it is possible that after George left, someone else hit Thomas with the hammer? But if so, who could that have been? Do you think the guilty of murder verdict was the correct one, or should it have been manslaughter? And finally, do you think the commutation of the sentence was the correct thing to do, and was 10 years enough for the crime committed? Do please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I do hope that you have found this a very strange, sad and tragic story interesting, and I am very sorry for the fact that I had a minor little cough near the start of the story. I actually was breathing, and as you may know yourselves, sometimes air goes the wrong way, and I was lucky that it was just a slight bit and then I didn't end up coughing for hours and not being able to speak anymore after that. Anyway, I just wanted to apologise for that again, because I really do hate making mistakes. I really do try to keep everything as never going to be perfect, because I'm not perfect, never will be, neither will any of these, because I will always make small mistakes, but I try not to make large mistakes like that one. So I do apologise again, and I think I better shut up now. So anyway, I thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again next week.